This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
And we might even have a part 1 and part 2, because I now want to delve, if possible, into the rich heart of the chapter, which is no less than 8 comparative case studies of the environmental movements in countries in Northeast Asia, in other words, mainland China. Well, perhaps I'll let you list them and tell us perhaps why you picked them or how you picked them.
Yes, so there are 8 cases. 3 are in the northeastern part of Asia, mainland China, Japan, South Korea. 3 from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, and 2 from Inner and Central Asia, Mongolia and Kazakhstan. And in the chapter introduction, I said I chose them first so that we truly get a broader view. Very often you say people present something on Asia, it's actually just East Asia, right? So I try my best. I've done more or less a bit of field work in many of these. Second is, they're not just because geographic coverage. They do represent 3 groups of so-called political regime type. One, mostly Japan is a stable, long-term stable democracy since the end of World War II. And some are newly consolidated democratic countries. They're new but consolidated, such as South Korea. And some are transitioning countries that they've gone into it or probably back up and then decide to go into again. I just read news, and I was talking to colleagues from Philippines. There's a new page of democracy in Philippines. It's very common in Southeast Asia that there are a new page. So the process can be very, very long. So there are a group of these countries that are very colorful, very fascinating. I do encourage everyone have a chance to read into it. Indonesia, Mongolia, and to some degree Kazakhstan, to some degree Vietnam as well, and to some degree Singapore. And then we have the other end of the spectrum that's so very classic non-democracies, such as mainland China. Singapore is a debatable case. A lot of scholars would say, oh, it's straightforward, but having lived and worked there, and also really locating the case in the spectrum of different cases, it has lots of hybrid features, has quite strong rule of law structure. So this is a very interesting city-state, and it reflects a lot of patterns that we often observe in other parts, but actually perfectly reflected in this city-state as well. And as well as Vietnam probably would be classified classic socialist non-democracy, but nevertheless, a lot of political liberalization happening. So I want to choose these groups to give a good sort of showcase of Asia, but also to cover different types of political contexts.
And I took that point as being very important. So if I was to simplify my reading of these case studies, I see how in some contexts, the state's failure to manage environmental crises, especially big pollution and health issues, became part of an anti-regime mobilization that then pushed forward to the democratic transition. And you say that that was really part of South Korea and Indonesia, and in both cases, partially resulted in the institutionalization or the inclusion of environmentalists in the new post-transition states and regimes. And that had some positive consequences, including the ability to pass beneficial laws. But the momentum was not always maintained. That's one trajectory, right, that you describe.
That's very, very wonderful summary. Yes. So in some cases that we witness, the environment movement is an integral, essential, a major component of the sort of pan-pro-democracy, right? Mm-hmm. And the more critically, the fruit of that was never lost in post-transition period. In fact, a lot of environmental activists were quickly absorbed and start taking key leadership role in the new government, particularly in the South Korea case, as well as Taiwan, which was not fully discussed, but I occasionally touch upon. Indonesia to a much less degree. Kazakhstan could have done that, but also, didn't happen. So that's when, you start with very similar beginnings, but you end with very different patterns. This is when this research becomes very exciting to political scientists. We could really search for what didn't happen, what triggered different directions. But you're right, in some cases, the environmental movement became the origin of a better environmental governance in the post-transition countries. But in others, it got lost.
And I think
and marginalized.
Yeah. What I took as your analysis of some of those countries where it did get marginalized was in part the activity of foreign actors. So on the one hand, the international ENGOs, the international environmental groups that funded and supported environmental organizations and sometimes were able to kind of bind the countries into international treaty regimes that created a positive trajectory for the environment. But on the other hand, sometimes those international environmental NGOs activities became increasingly rejected by governments. And also there was the malign influence of foreign corporations, particularly through corruption, but also through ordinary business ties and lobbying and advocacy that pushed the governments away from an environmental agenda, sometimes even implicitly asking the governments to repress the environmentalists. And so that was another dynamic that you talk about in the chapters.
That's very true as well. That dynamic is also sort of multi-layered.
Yeah.
You summarized very well, but yes, but I do encourage still look at the cases. There's just so many different bits and pieces. We try our best to sort of simplify for Central Asia cases because the inference of or the scare of cover revolution is more evident.
Let's dive into one of those. I like Kazakhstan. I'm sure that most of our audience, like ourselves, Unica, I think I'm probably right in saying we knew little about Kazakhstan before reading your chapter. So if you want to talk about some of that complexity in the context of that country.
Yes. So Kazakhstan and Indonesia might exhibit a seemingly very similar patterns in terms of the potential was very high for the environmental agenda to be carried along after democratic transition, but nevertheless, it didn't happen. But the causes are actually quite different. They're similar, but still there are different elements. Kazakhstan being in the vicinity of the post-Soviet space was much, sort of the sense of color revolution is much more evident. And the whole civil society was so much, had such a strong legacy. When I was meeting these human rights lawyers, environmental rights lawyers, the memory of the 1980s, the anti-nuclear movement was so strong. And that was the origin of a very coherent civil society. It was very coherent with the pro-democracy, pro-humanitarianism, But nevertheless, because immediately these are the ones funded, gets a lot of attention and funding from Europe and to a lesser degree, a lot of from Europe. And then because of color revolution and also because of the domestic strongman politics.
Sorry, I'll just stop you for a second. I don't know if everyone is going to know what the color revolution refers to.
Yes. It's a series of social movements and the pro-democracy movements happened actually all the way across former communist area and particularly former Soviet space, including Ukraine, Georgia, And in many ways, people also consider that as a precursor of the Arab Spring. So sort of the color revolution continued on to the Middle East and Northern Africa. So it's a social movement with a very strong inclination to endorse democratic principles. A lot of times, yes, very good reminder. I think these are important actually events in the past 20 years. Yes, and in the former Soviet space, the color revolution is very often pictured by the ruling regime as Western triggered. So very much the official rhetoric has put a particular sort of twist on it, is that it's the foreign influence. It's the particular external governments try to change the way we do politics at home. So there's a very strong sort of anti-West element being attached to these movements in the former Soviet space countries. So, and also because of what Putin did with Russia. So many countries followed his footsteps, started having a lot of laws against international NGOs. International non-governmental organizations becomes the culprit of this external influences. So that really negatively affected a lot of domestic NGOs, or in many ways that now there's a new ecology of environmental organizations in many of these countries, including even China. And I do anticipate very soon will be Vietnam as well, is that there are so-called domestic NGOs, and there are these NGOs with external links. And they will be bearing lots of political risks.
And you highlighted that, I think, at one point in the chapter, because you also talked about government organized NGOs or Ngos, which it's sort of a space where, depending on the political context, you may be able to have a genuine community-led organization, or you may only be able to function under the umbrella of these government-sanctioned groups.
That's right. So there are this sector, this space is very contested, and we can't even judge by just reading the names, because you've got to read the history of the organizations, and you realize, that's why they're doing this. Yeah. So for certain countries, the complexity was triggered because of this series of events. For Indonesia, I think Winfield is much, has already, I don't want to repeat, is that there's the complication of business interests. And some are not necessarily corruption, some are just business interests. And when there's a good market, the global demand is so high, it's hard to say no.
That's right.
And I wanted to emphasize that in a different writing when I opened up more, talking more about developing countries in general. It's hard to say no for a young country post-conflict or a newly independent, newly post-colonial country. Governments need good economic standing to be able to implement social welfare, to be able to implement good education policies, to provide retirement, to provide labor insurance. For new young countries, it's hard to say no.
That's right. And of course, many of these countries are vast. So in the case of Indonesia,
yes,
there's such a strong center periphery dynamic as well, where, elites in Jakarta, they don't always act at in the interests of local island communities or local farmer communities. And the extraction of resources can be contested, and the voice of rural communities can be a lot less, let alone adding on to that the ethnic religious complexities, which also are at play. And that's true in many of these countries, that the colonial lens obscures many existing cleavages which persist to this day. And the action for the environment in some groups is a lot harder than others. Some regions have less voice than others within these countries. But I feel like I'm speaking in the face of one of the questions that you raised earlier, Unica. I don't know if you'd like to put forward one or more of the questions that you'd been talking about to our esteemed expert.
Yeah, maybe I want to ask more about the table that you made, Feng-Shi, like with the environmental performance and also the environmental movements. Like when I saw there, like based on global rankings of environmental performance, like Japan has the highest achievement, right, compared to other Asian countries and compared to a few years ago. And Kazakhstan is also not too bad. And how to read the table, if you could please explain more compared to their move.
Let me just jump in and ask you, which table is that, Unica, for the
Table
benefit
3.
of any? Table 3, yeah. So for the
Table,
benefit
yeah.
of any students that are following along, we're talking about table 3 now. Okay, please go on.
Please go on, Unica.
Yeah. Like how to read the table compared to their movements that you put on the previous one on table 2 and table 3. Yeah, because like in table 2, like for the transformative impact, there's a significant transformative, but now it is less compared like a few years ago. Like, do you mind like to explain more about the comparative table between the performance and their movements?
The 3 tables actually, was put together in a way just for people, if they have limited time, they can just read the tables. The first 2 are more, I would say, more important, because these 2 sort of summarize the arguments. Table 3 is almost a footnote, but I just wanted to give some evidence. And I really like the work done at Yale. This particular index, there's so many different environmental indexes, ecological footprint index, but this is a good one. This is a social scientific one. This is, table 3 is just to elaborate that most of the Asian countries, except a very few, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, many of them are not doing particularly well. That's just a mere sort of fact, even though they have many of them, the same group, these countries who haven't really changed. Well, I should clarify. We shouldn't say, absolutely they're not doing well. They haven't changed much. Their ranking haven't really, changed. So in the past 20 to 30 years, they haven't, their relative standing in terms of environmental performance haven't really changed within the big family of the countries on the planet. Nevertheless, the same group, their ranking of economic performance jumped. I probably should have put another economic performance, so to show that they're economic overachievers, and in a way sort of underwhelming in the environmental field. That was just to support that particular point. Table 1 is to elaborate on the political context where they are in terms of politics. Table 2 is to talk about where they are in terms of the relative development of, broadly speaking, very broad environmental movements.
It is fascinating to reflect on that, and ties in with the concept of political opportunity structure, which there's a whole chapter that is designed to explaining that concept. But just to simplify, the idea is that the actions of a movement alone don't determine the outcomes for the people and for the environment. It depends on what else is going on for the country, including the responsiveness of the elite and the other constraints that they face and the actions of other advocates. So, for example, we could see a vibrant and active environmental movement in South Korea that's accompanied by an increase in rankings from 42 to 94 in table 3. Does that mean that they're getting better or worse, Feng-Shi? I'm so ignorant, I don't even know.
Oh, so the bigger the number is, the lower.
Yeah.
The worse performance.
Yeah.
So there was, yeah.
It radically dropped from 2006 to 2010, and then it improved again to 2020. Yes. So it seems very volatile.
It's good we point that, and in a way they're extraordinary in terms of they only took some 10 years to come back. And this is a pattern actually very frequent for a lot more countries to embark on this so-called democratization. The first 10 to 20 years, we should witness actually environmental loss, ecological loss, environmental degradation. And many of them, it will take longer than this period, this deteriorating period. Many of them will climb back, but it will take a longer time. But for South Korea and Taiwan as well, it took relatively shorter time. And this is extraordinary what South Korea has achieved. The first 10 years, or the immediate aftermath of regime change, when we say democratization, when you change from a non-democracy to a democracy, it's very messy.
Yeah.
It's many countries, not only they change their regime types, they also change their king, or they don't have king anymore, or they have got rid of, or they lost half the country, or they had extra territories and new religions, and it's very messy. So new countries are very busy, and a lot of times all at the expense of environmental situations. Yeah.
I think that's a kind of a great point to end on. We'll need to end soon just because we have to render the recording before we go on to the next. But before we do, I guess I'd just like to invite Unica to close with what is the sort of key takeaway point that you got from this chapter? And then I'll say mine, or should I say mine first, Unica, while you're thinking?
Yes, please, maybe.
Well, as I said at the start, really appreciated the opportunity that this chapter provides to go both wide and deep. So the deep, detailed case studies of the countries, it's really impressive. And in the context of the very impressive handbook, this chapter stands out as its contribution to scholarship. I just think it's so vital. But then in addition to that depth, to have the comparative wide element, that really appreciated it. And to reflect deeply on the role of liberalization and democratization, because as I've been studying with other students, the environmental movements in Latin America or in Eastern Europe and so on, the varied relationship of environmental movement success to governance has really been a standout. But you've reflected deeply on that and some factors that can explain those different trajectories. So I appreciated that about this chapter. What about you, Unica?
Yeah, thank you. Like, it is very interesting to see the various environmental movements in Asia. As I think, as an Indonesian, this is a relatively new field for me as an Indonesian scholar. Yeah, because like as you say, that Asian countries are a very big country. Like, we have different political movements, and we have a very huge task like to do. If we want to see from the Western countries, that we have a lot of things to do to have like impactful environmental movements. And yeah, I learned more, and I learned a lot from your writing. Thank you so much, Francie.
Very good. What was the one thing that you learned?
Does the Indonesian case make sense to you? Sorry.
Sorry.
I could quickly ask you.
Yes, of course.
Does the Indonesia case, do you find my take on Indonesia?
Yeah, I think it's very true about Indonesia. Yeah, because from the democratic countries, like we are now in the developing the new system and everything. So we are still far away to go from our condition now. But yeah, from what you have written, it is very true about Indonesia, I think.
Very good to hear.
And I was going to ask you somewhat cheekily, Fengqi, to tell us the one thing that you find the most important point in your chapter.
Compare and compare and compare. I think it's not just a method. I think it's a very effective method, I would like to say. And it is also a perspective and its attitude. I think a lot of things can be said by itself just by putting these different tables, next to each other, and putting the short history next to each other, and I think it's it's sort of the interpretation comes out. So it's a very effective method.
I really agree. And how fun to end a chapter with advice on methodology. As an academic, I appreciate that. So I'll say thank you to you, Unica and Fengxi, for being here today. And I'll say thank you to our viewers and a little wave to them.
Indeed, thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Great. Let me just stop the recording.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.